So the time has finally come to review Woodford's latest video on the subject of trans athletes. Now I'd just like to start by noting the fact that I won't be responding to Woodford's video and the arguments contained in the order he has presented them. Some points are more important than others to the degree of being foundational to the entire conversation, and therefore should be addressed first. Woodford also spends a great deal of time complaining about the fact that people held him accountable to his actions, claiming that this was assuming malice. And whilst I will cover that, the evidence is priority here. I've personally found his actions thus far to come off as disingenuous, therefore to start with the solid science seems the smart move. You can check my previous 3 videos produced in response to each of Woodford's videos for why I feel that way. In much the same way that my videos responding to religious content are produced on the basis that, in all likelihood, I won't convince the creator of that video that they're wrong, I must take the same approach here. First and foremost, I'm here to show the many faults in Woodford's updated video, because whilst it's being heralded as an improvement by many, the evidence disagrees. So let us start with the burden of proof on the subject.
And this brings us comfortably to the burden of proof and where exactly it lies.
Woodford needs to do 3 things. First, he needs to show which of these traits survive the HRT process and to which degree. Second, he needs to demonstrate superior performance on part of trans women on HRT. Third, he needs to demonstrate a causal relation leading from point 1 to point 2. Without that, he has nothing.
Actually, no. The burden of proof is on you, us, and here's why. Given that in most events men outperform women by 10 to 30%, we need to show that HRT completely removes, or at least sufficiently mitigates, the athletic advantages granted by male puberty, and until we do that, we are not justified in claiming that fairness has been achieved. Now, thanks to Joanna Harper, and this is another thing that I'll elaborate on within my upcoming video, I'm currently convinced that when it comes to long and middle distance running, the burden either has been met or it's close to being met, since in these events they rely very heavily on hemoglobin, and HRT does indeed lower hemoglobin to the appropriate level. But in other events, and especially those which pivot on such things as height, frame, and fast twitch muscle fibers, the burden not only hasn't been met, it's heavier than it's ever been before, which is to say that the evidence is overwhelmingly to the contrary. Again, I'll elucidate on this and the burden of proof in detail in the future, but I feel compelled to give the short of it now since it's certainly relevant.
Except this is entirely false. Not only were you the one calling for action on the basis of your unfounded assertions,
and I'm convinced that unless quickly rectified, this will kill women's sport. I don't want to see the day when women's athletics is dominated by Y chromosomes, but without a change in policy, that is precisely what's going to happen.
But it also fails to take into account the fact that said actions would be in direct violation of numerous human rights belonging to trans women. This is something I started with in my original response and, rather disturbingly, has been missing from every video on the subject you have done, including this one. The point is simple. When it comes to making ethical decisions, which this very much is, one should always default to the position with the least potential to cause harm. On one hand, we have the active violation of numerous human rights of trans women. On the other, we have... well, you along with everyone else has failed to demonstrate anything on that level. About the worst thing I've seen are claims that records would become oversaturated with trans women. But here's the important thing to remember. Records are just that. Records. They can always be reverted if it's ever shown that trans women do in fact possess some unfair advantage and should be barred from competing with cis women, whether as a whole or in specific categories. Isn't that typically what happens when someone is found to be cheating? Which, by the way, is what you are suggesting trans women are doing. But you're a long way from showing that. Much like supporting the claim of a divine Jesus, Woodford has to make his way through several tiers of evidence. Key traits need to be shown to survive HRT. Those traits as a collective need to be shown to give an advantage. That advantage needs to be shown to be unfair. And all of this needs to be done before we can even begin to suggest that trans women are a threat to women's sport. You also should have noted that the reason you know about the Harper study is because it was reference 28 in my original video. Now, I don't care about receiving credit, but I do care about the way you are presenting me. I didn't simply state that the burden of proof was on you as a cheap tactic as we're very familiar with when it comes to religious apologists. I still went out of my way to find all the relevant research on the matter I could and discussed it, because that was the honest thing to do. On the other hand, what's not honest is claiming that the burden of proof on other events is heavier than it's ever been before. This insinuates that you have evidence to the contrary in relation to those events, whilst failing to supply it. And that's one of the main things a lot of people miss about the whole "it's a subject needing discussion." We're more than happy to talk about the topic, but until we have evidence to show an unfair advantage, all discussion on said lines is purely speculative. Therefore, any calls to action on the basis of said speculation are not only without merit, but potentially harmful, especially when subtext, like that Woodford just used, enters the picture. Now that the burden of proof is out of the way, let's move on to what Woodford admits he got wrong, since I have a few things to add to what he says. I also feel it better frames the rest of what he then goes on to claim are the mistakes I made.
And I'll just reinforce that while I don't accept the following lacings of malice, I wholeheartedly accept and appreciate the intellectual criticisms.
Woodford utilised a basic bait and switch. He invited us to discuss the counter that trans women on HRT don't have an advantage due to said HRT. That was what he advertised. He then went on to assert that many of said traits remain in spite of HRT. That's when the switch took place. Instead of referencing articles on the differences between cis women and trans women who have undergone HRT, Woodford goes on to roll out articles discussing the differences between cis women and cis men.
Now this was, in my opinion, my biggest intellectual blunder. At the time, after explaining some of the reasons as to why men have an athletic advantage over women, I intended to show that while HRT evidently sufficiently reduces many of these advantages, such as hematocrit, it hasn't been shown to sufficiently reduce many other advantages, such as height, width, limb proportions, muscle fibre type, heart size, lung capacity, and muscle fibre. The problem, of course, is that I somehow failed to include the second part, and consequently, I damn messed up. I equivocated trans women with non-trans men, and that's a huge mistake that could have been fixed with just a paragraph or two. Another of my intellectual mistakes refers to hemoglobin.
Did you get that, you unrehearsed emotional college students? Hemoglobin is the #1 advantage cis men have over cis women. Well, this is awkward. You see, this is what happens when you attempt a bait and switch, using studies comparing cis women to cis men, rather than cis women to trans women on HRT. You end up talking a load of pure bollocks about hemoglobin being the greatest source of trans woman advantage, only to then discover that hemoglobin counts of trans women are the same as those of cis women.
Indeed, my views on hemoglobin were mistaken. You see, I had read a few studies which compared the mean hemoglobin levels of trans women to non-trans women, which indeed are significantly higher. But what those studies didn't make clear, and what I now know, is that while the average trans woman on HRT has greater hemoglobin in their blood than the average non-trans woman, it's still within the typical range of the latter. In hindsight, I should have focused on the aforementioned athletic advantages of muscle mass, height, and muscle fibre type, as HRT doesn't bring these advantages down to the typical range.
Which is funny since you made the exact same mistake just now, as I will discuss in a second. But first of all, I have to draw attention to the text you had pop up on screen, which stated, quote, "By sufficient, I mean within the typical range of non-trans female athletes," end quote. Thing is, what do you mean by typical range? Do you mean within the range of every cis athlete ever? Do you mean so many standard deviations from the average or mean? It's kind of an important question since it'll impact our conclusion. As a guiding tool, I'd like to propose a simple principle. If your argument against trans women's participation in sport can be used to bar cis women, said argument is inherently flawed and should be discarded. So if your arguments would exclude cis women athletes such as Margot Diak, who is a 2.18 meter basketball player, you'll likely need a new argument. So with that sorted, let's carry on to what else you showed on screen, namely this figure from Transsexuals and Competitive Sports. The top bar highlighted is one of trans women on HRT, and the bottom bar highlighted is of pre-HRT trans men. The pre-HRT trans men have been taken as a substitute for cis women, which I'm fine with doing, but I just want to note that fact clearly. When I talk about the range of cis women, I'm using the range of pre-HRT trans men as a guide in the same way that Woodford is doing. Now what's interesting is the part Woodford has chosen to highlight, namely the circle in the middle and the two whiskers extending from the sides. Though one can't deny, it is visually striking. The difference is very distinct, it's very bold. Thing is, this is not the range for either group. This is. So, in the exact same fashion as your hemoglobin mistake, you once again confused mean, this time with standard deviation, with range. We see that almost all of the trans women on HRT fit inside the range of pre-HRT trans men, a range we both agree will be the same for cis women. So, focusing on this wouldn't have helped you. And before you claim this wasn't made clear to you, I suggest you read that figure annotation you repeatedly displayed on screen as you put the figure up. You, my friend, went full Sargon of Akkad, which is impressive, though disturbing. And this is the second time you've made that mistake. Well, I guess we'll have to wait another couple of months for a clarification video. Now, some may say that trans women should be excluded since they're still outside the standard deviation for cis women. But here's the problem. So are all these people, and by proxy the portion of cis women they represent. So if you're going to exclude trans women on that basis, you also have to exclude these women on that basis, or you're just unfairly discriminating. So it fails the test on that level. But it gets worse. You see, the study carried out a linear regression model on the relationship between height and muscle area, and what they found was that when it comes to muscle area, the biggest determining factor was the participant's height, even when they corrected for chromosomes with a multivariate model. The researchers concluded that the main ethical consideration when it comes to the participation of trans female athletes as it pertains to muscle area was height. And on that note, I'd just like to give a big thank you to scientist Sam for helping me understand what was being stated here. And it's true, trans women are on average taller, but as shown through the earlier point on Margot Dyack, trans women do not have some monopoly on height. Another fact to consider is that most strength sports such as weightlifting and combat sports already account for height. They do so by having weighted categories. As size increases, so does one's weight. Fact is, none of what Woodford supplies, accurate or not, heavy on the not, even begins to address the subject of advantages like the study I supplied on runners did. As noted in my original video, listing traits which don't change or fail to match up to cis women isn't enough. Physiological traits are not simply a cumulative or linear equation when it comes to ability. Their relationship to one another is dynamic. For example, height and bone density, which was an advantage when present with the appropriate muscle mass, can become a disadvantage if only that muscle mass changes. This is because less muscle is moving a greater total mass. That's why it's necessary for you to not only show which traits remain and to what degree, but to show an active advantage resulting from said traits. In my original video, I acknowledged that not every trait changed or did so to levels equatable to cis women, and that in no way harms my case, as I've just demonstrated. So please don't make the mistake of thinking otherwise. And with all that addressed, do continue. There's also another trick at play here. By focusing on the typical range of testosterone whilst discussing national and international level sports, you are implicitly claiming that women at such sporting events as the Olympics are representative of the typical woman.
This is also a fair criticism. I should have emphasised that while female athletes have, with very few exceptions, testosterone levels within the typical range of non-athletes, they do tend to sit on the higher part of that range. Though, and this might surprise you, as it did me, the opposite is true of endurance athletes. Research shows that circulating levels of testosterone, or current levels of testosterone, vary significantly from one athletic event to another. In explosive events, such as sprinting, swimming, cycling, kayaking, and speed skating, test levels are on the high end of the female range. But in endurance events, such as long and middle distance running, test levels are on the low end. And that's one of the reasons why the scientific community frequently notes that circulating testosterone isn't the be-all and end-all. It seems that just as fast-twitch muscle fibers are critical in some sports but negligible in others, the same is true of circulating testosterone. It's evidently less what one's current levels are and more what one's previous elevated levels have given them.
You know, I'm currently waiting for verification on fast twitch muscle fibers. This is like others have also thrown at me as apparent evidence of an advantage. Thing is, they're often mentioned, but never referenced. I did have someone attempt to do so back when this whole thing started. Only problem is the two studies were invalid. The first didn't have anything to do with anti-androgens, and the second was a mouse study. And can I just say, I scrolled through the entire month of May on Twitter just to find those references. They come from a conversation I had at the very end of April, but I had read those studies, so by damn, I'm going to reference them. Now, Woodford certainly didn't offer any valid reference in the description of his video, so what gives? Why keep mentioning fast twitch muscle fibers unless you have something to go on?
So there's the mistakes that I made, or at least the majority of them. I'm now going to move on to Ethel's mistakes, but don't let that dampen mine. I screwed up, and I own that fact. While I reject the malice motive that some have attributed to me, I absolutely recognise that my honest mistakes caused real harm, and I am sincerely sorry for that. The original video is now delisted, and I've donated all of the ad revenue that it made to the transgender charity Sparkle. I know that it will never make up for the harm that I've caused, and that many of you will never consider me an ally again. I understand.
I didn't realise we consider you an ally to begin with. I thought we just kind of saw you as sort of neutral. Also, it's not so much the malice behind your video. I mean, I said I hoped I was wrong and would like you to prove it. Then within 2 days of me posting, we reached an uneasy truce. It wasn't your initial words that made me think you were disingenuous, it was your subsequent actions when you were informed of this. And there's a very big difference between the two. Now I've already been over the actions you have taken in my previous video, so I'll leave this point here.
So the first of Ethel's objections that I'd like to respond to refers to the fact that trans women don't always win.
What's interesting about the Rachel McKinnon case is the fact that the person responsible for attacking her, Wagner Asali, who came third, beat McKinnon in 10 out of 12 previous events. And not only did Asali fail to raise issue during those times, but apparently those 10 times can be ignored since McKinnon won the 2018 UCI Track Championship. The implication here being that a trans woman competing isn't a problem, just so long as she never wins.
Ethel went on to make the same point about Laurel Hubbard.
Whilst Hubbard holds the snatch record, she does not hold the clean and jerk record or the total record for her category.
And also in regards to Hannah Mountsie.
Also, she's been on the losing team before, so it's not like her presence guarantees victory.
Now, the problem with this objection is that it completely misses the point. If one has an unfair advantage but loses, they still had an unfair advantage. Fairness, which is the foundation of sports and athletics, isn't about who crosses the line first. It's about ensuring that all participants spring from the same starting block. If I ran a marathon against Mo Farah and was given a 30-minute advantage, he'd still easily beat me, but I'd still have had a significant unfair advantage. Hence, the question is whether or not McKinnon, Hubbard, Mountsie, and other trans women who have experienced male puberty still retain any of the athletic advantages that they receive from said male puberty. And if they do, whether or not they constitute a too greater advantage in the specific events that they desire to compete in. At elite level athletics, in most events the difference between first and second place is less than 1%. I'll say that again as it's absolutely critical. In most events, the difference between first and second place is statistically less than 1%, and so any retained advantages that are not mitigated by other disadvantages is simply too much. To quote Noel Plum, who recently released an absolutely brilliant video on this subject,
"In sport, when it comes to performance enhancement, close enough is not close enough."
Now the problem with your response is that it completely misses the point. This was a response to the availability heuristic, also known as availability bias, that you were relying upon. All of the names were cases you listed as examples where a trans woman had won, the media had caught wind of this and had made a national or even international story out of it. You use these few wins as evidence as to why you believe trans women were destroying women's sports. That is the only reason I ever responded on said anecdotes, because they were your anecdotes and ignored the vast majority of times where trans women lose. The same thing happens with air travel. People tend to remember the stories about plane crashes, but forget all the millions of safe landings that take place. That's your bias, not mine. I'm fine with not talking about said cases, so long as you stop bringing them up. It's very dishonest of you to try and pan off your problems onto me. Also, what I said on Rachel McKinnon does stand. In the 11 times she was beaten by Jen Wagner Silly, nothing was said about her as of yet mythic advantage, which you claim still existed. It was only once McKinnon won a high-profile race did it suddenly become an issue. This not only shows a selective outrage, but completely diminishes the hard-earned achievements of people like McKinnon who slave to get where they are. As for Noel, the show continues.
So, let's get to Ethel's next objection.
Miller beat Seoul by 0.37 seconds, yet Miller's own time was still 0.35 seconds slower than the current women's record, which stands at 6.65 seconds. Does that then mean that cis women have clear advantage over trans women?
This criticism, of course, relates to trans women not always winning, and it suffers from all the same flaws. If one has an unfair advantage but loses, they still had an unfair advantage. Yes, due to HRT, Miller's testosterone is likely now within the range of non-trans women, and because of this, some of the benefits that she received from male puberty are now mitigated, such as circulating hemoglobin. But other benefits haven't been, such as muscle mass. Now don't get me wrong, HRT reduces muscle mass by over half, but to again quote Noel,
Cutting half is not good enough. Cutting whole is what it has to be. You need to go all the way or have some mitigating factors that will counteract it for it to count. But cutting half, it's not close enough. Close enough is never close enough when it comes to a performance advantage, an unfair performance advantage in sport.
Right, except both yourself and Noel have failed to demonstrate an advantage. Harold, you failed to show the muscle mass of trans women post-HRT is above that of cis women, because neither of you could be bothered to read a figure annotation. So this is just Noel's incessant whining followed by your equally ignorant stamp of approval. Now, just a quick warning, the next section is quite long.
Okay, so now I'd like to respond to the most frequent criticism that I've received, that being that trans women have been able to compete since 2004, and yet they haven't come to dominate. Ethel and many others see this as strong evidence for trans women not having an advantage whatsoever.
And to that end, I'd just like to note the fact that the Olympics has allowed trans women to compete since 2004. That's 15 years of trans women being allowed to compete at the Olympic level. And in spite of all of this, trans women have not come to dominate said games. Again, we have 15 years of trans women being allowed to compete in female categories at the Olympics, yet we have absolutely no evidence of what you claim will happen unless we act quickly.
Yes, trans athletes have been able to compete since 2004, but up until 2015, and effectively 2016, the rules were drastically different. Until 2015, trans women had to 1. Be legally recognised as a woman, which of course was near impossible for those living in countries in which changing one's gender is illegal. 2. They had to have undergone gender reassignment surgery, which is to say they had to have removed their testicles. And 3. They had to have received appropriate hormone therapy for at least 2 years. Now this might not sound like a huge change from today's rules of 1. Non-legally identifying as a woman, and 2. Having testosterone levels below 10 nanomoles per litre for 12 months, but it is. While our adrenal glands produce a very small amount of testosterone, the vast majority comes from our gonads, that being the ovaries in women and testes in men. Hence, without testicles, a trans woman can't produce anywhere near the 10 nanomole limit, and will almost entirely depend on exogenous testosterone to maintain sufficient levels. However, with testicles, a trans woman can simply reduce her HRT as to allow her testosterone to be much closer to the 10 nanomole limit. Now you might be thinking, wait, Steve, why are you so certain that such manipulation is likely to occur? Well, that's my next topic.
Woodford seems to be taking it as a given that since these are the limits for sport, that most trans women in sport will aim to sit on the very edge or said limit. But how does that relate to reality? According to the guidelines put out by the International Planned Parenthood Federation, anti-androgens, also known as testosterone blockers, should be used to reduce the rates of testosterone in trans women's bodies to somewhere between 30 to 100 nanograms per deciliter, just above 3 nanomoles per litre, the typical range for a cis woman.
From here, Ethel goes on to cite recommendations from several other medical institutions to bolster her point.
None of which come anywhere near the 288 nanograms per deciliter, the 10 nanomoles per litre that Woodford is crying about.
And she concludes by reasoning that because of this, trans women are at a disadvantage in regards to testosterone.
In fact, many of the suggested targets cap trans women's testosterone levels at the lower end of a typical range for cis women. So if anyone is at a sporting disadvantage in regard to testosterone, it's most of trans women on HRT.
Now, to be honest, this objection is naive. The truth is that athletes have, and still do, sacrifice their health and safety in pursuit of their goals, as they know all too well that if they don't, they'll be outcompeted by those who do. Back when steroids were legal, and like today, not medically recommended, athletes happily admitted to taking them.
Steroids are taken 8 or 9, 10 weeks before competition. It's not a healthy thing to do, but it's being used.
Did you take them?
I took them, yeah, up until the competition, 8 or 9 weeks before competition, and it was something that everybody had to do in order to get an equal chance to, to compete.
And even when steroids were banned, athletes did, and still do, everything they can to pass drug screening, despite the fact that they know that getting caught will likely end their career. Another more recent example that comes to mind is MMA and the issue of testosterone replacement therapy. Long story short, institutions such as the UFC once allowed participants who had a prescription for TRT to compete. As a result, it has been suggested that participants took steroids to suppress their natural testosterone, and then, after their cycle, went to their doctor in the attempt and very often success of being prescribed TRT. They didn't care about their health, they cared about winning. Why? Because they're athletes, and that's what athletes do. They do what it takes to win. The point is, athletes will, more often than not, operate at the very limits of what's permitted. And since the IOC, as of 2015, no longer requires trans women to undergo gender reassignment surgery to compete, and hence keep their testicles, hovering at around 8 to 9 nanomoles per litre is an extremely viable advantage for trans women to utilise. In fact, this is one of the primary reasons that Joanna Harper, among many others, are campaigning to reduce the level to 5 nanomoles per litre.
I am part of a committee that has recently recommended that we lower that limit from 10 to 5.
Now, what's a little odd to me is that in other areas, Ethel seemingly accepts this competitive inevitability.
The Olympics and similar national and international level sports are not a children's gym class. They are the pinnacle of human capability. Nations are willing to pour millions of dollars into Olympic teams for the chance to win gold medals. And they'll do their research to figure out the easiest way to maximize that.
Indeed they will, and they know that hovering at 8 to 9 nanomoles provides trans women with a massive advantage in many events.
I love the way you cut me off there. Let's see the rest of what I had to say. Nations are willing to pour millions of dollars into Olympic teams for the chance to win gold medals, and they'll do their research to figure out the easiest way to maximize that. So if there were strong evidence that trans women had a clear advantage over cis women, it would be very reasonable to expect nations to start hunting for trans athletes. Not for the benefit of said athletes, but to ensure the best shot at gold in the Olympics to uphold a capitalistic sense of national pride. But that doesn't happen. There are next to no trans Olympians, let alone any all-trans lineups. But that's not the only editing used to make my position appear weaker than it actually is. You see, Woodford started his segment about science by talking about testosterone, before he went on to assert that testosterone didn't change a multitude of other factors which were apparently also responsible for the advantage trans women have over cis women.
To steal an analogy from a friend, saying that transgender women should be able to compete against women so long as they identify as one and have testosterone levels lower than one is like saying that a Formula 1 car should be able to compete as a superbike so long as it identifies as one and has less fuel than one.
Now I just want you lot, the viewers, to hazard a guess. Did I bring up this point about the Olympics in response to the discussion on testosterone? Or after he'd already gone on to assert that the traits which survive androgen deprivation offer an advantage? Of course, it was the latter. Just consider the timestamps involved. I began covering Woodford's testosterone argument at 6 minutes 15 seconds into my video. I then went on to start tackling his claims about the traits which remained after androgen deprivation at 13 minutes and 20 seconds in. Meanwhile, the first time I brought up trans participation in the Olympics as an argument was in the 41st minute of my video. Woodford's arguments had moved beyond testosterone, and so too had my response. But all of that context is completely missing from Woodford's video, since if he included it, it'd show what an actively dishonest person he is. And what happens when we acknowledge this fact? Does Woodford's response about the changing rules make sense? No. Gonads or no gonads, whatever trait survived one form of androgen deprivation will survive both. Now we'll come back to Woodford's editing later since it's not just the once this happens. Yet I'd also like to discuss the rather trivializing way in which Woodford presents what trans people who feel the need to physically transition go through. Namely, gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is anxiety and depression which results from failing to adhere to one's gender. Now often we talk about this in relation to a society refusing to let a trans person be who they are, but it can also be self-inflicted. But the point is, this is not something that is a risk to be weighed. It's not a I might be caught. It's not a I might develop physical problems down the line. It's a this will fuck me up psychologically and make it so I can't train. What's really interesting is that in one of the anecdotes Woodford uses, that of track runners Miller and Yearwood, both were competing in open track competitions. And yet, as I noted in my original video, in spite of the fact that all they had to do was identify as female and the CIAC rules stated they would be allowed to compete, both were on HRT. Adding to insult, your comparison to what happened at the UFC is incredibly flawed. To elaborate on that in ways Woodford failed to do, cis men would take steps to reduce their testosterone to receive medical recommendations to receive testosterone replacement therapy. So, whilst they'd be without testosterone for a short period, again, this would only be a short period before they had it replaced. With trans people on HRT, that's not an option. If they commit to that, they have to commit to gender dysphoria for the rest of their sporting career. So, to even place the two in the same category of personal cost is just really showing of just how little you know about the experience of trans people. As for Harper and what she says, isn't it funny how you decided to leave this clip out?
Well, I actually agree with you there. And in fact, I am part of a committee that has recently recommended that we lower that limit from 10 to 5. And it's important to understand that that's a limit. The vast majority of transgender women will keep their testosterone below 3 and in fact below 2 and usually below 1 nanomole.
Right.
So this is an upper limit, but I absolutely agree. 10 is too high, and our committee has recommended bringing it down to 5.
Now as for her suggestions, I disagree with her. Not because of how this will impact trans women, but how such regulations are already impacting cis intersex women, such as Caster Semenya. Again, we return to my rule of thumb. If your standard excludes cis women, it's a bad standard and shouldn't then be applied to trans women, since that actually demonstrates that said trans women are within the range cis women exist in. Now, the only other way I could think this to be relevant is if you believe cis men will lie, pretend to be trans women, and then use that to compete. At which point, not only do you seek to punish both cis and trans women for the potential actions of cis men, just tell me, how does that differ from the "and men will claim to be trans to access women's bathroom" myth? How? Also, a slightly pedantic point, but one I owe scientist Sam since he's somewhat annoyed at your general lack of knowledge on the subject. Steroids are still legal in bodybuilding. There's still no risk for the participants in said activities to talk openly about them.
The next objection I'd like to address relates to men typically having larger bodies than women.
But the presupposition that larger bodies benefits trans athletes is just that, a presupposition in need of evidence to back it up.
Yes, having a large body isn't an advantage in many events, such as equestrian and gymnastics, but in events such as weightlifting and hammer throw, to give just two examples, it very much is. In fact, the fact that men are on average taller and wider than women widely is recognised as one of the primary factors for the massive gap between them. And again, HRT doesn't sufficiently mitigate height and width. If Mountsie, for example, hadn't have experienced male puberty, she wouldn't be as tall and as wide as she is.
Except she's within the total range for cis women in a team sport, so the impact of her abilities will be lessened as well, so you've really got no point here. And as already noted, many non-team strength-based sports already account for height by weight categories. Categories, I should note, I am in full favour of increasing for female sports, since they cut off much lower than male categories, even though they have large women, both trans and cis, competing.
Anyhow, the last objection I'm going to tackle is the most prominent study that Ethel referenced.
There is no direct and consistent research to suggest that transgender female individuals and transgender male individuals have an athletic advantage in sport, and therefore the majority of competitive sports policies are discriminatory against this population.
Indeed, this is the very study that many claim, including Dusty Smith, proves that trans women have no advantage.
Sports, medicine, trans. That's how easy this is to find. And, okay, boom, the very first link that comes up. The most basic amount of research you could possibly fucking do, right? So why did he not share the most in-depth scientific study with his audience on the subject he is talking about? Instead, why did he show a Joe Rogan clip instead of sharing the science? Well, in my opinion, it's because the most in-depth study that is done on the subject goes against his narrative, and he doesn't want you to know that.
Now, I'm going to thoroughly break down all of the relevant papers, including this one, in my future video. But to briefly address it now, let's go a step further than Dusty and do the most basic amount of reading. First off, if you read the title, you can see that it's a systemic review of the literature relating to sport participation and competitive sport policies, which is to say, it's not a review of athletic performance, a fact that the authors make even more clear in their objective. Scrolling down, if you read the method, you'll see that of the 8 studies that it references, 6 are interviews, with most having a sample size less than 5, and only 1 study actually relates to trans athletic performance, that being Goran and Bunk. And if you read their study, you'll see that among other things, that while HRT significantly reduces muscle mass in trans women, it doesn't reduce it to anywhere near the same level as non-trans women. Anyhow, back to the systemic study, as from here things just get worse. The authors not only assert that
there is no direct and consistent research to suggest that transgender female individuals and transgender male individuals have an athletic advantage in sport,
but also that there's no direct or consistent research to suggest that they have any advantage at any stage of their transition, e.g. cross-sex hormones and gender-confirming surgery. I'll say that again. Any stage. Which is to say that if your position is that trans women should be able to compete so long as they're on HRT, then you ain't getting it from this review. But yeah, more on that to come.
First of all, let's deal with the straw man. We didn't claim that it proved trans women don't have an advantage. We noted the fact that it shows those calling for action to be taken against trans women, people such as yourself, lack any and all basis for said calls to action. Therefore, said policies are discriminatory. The distinction is important. As noted, the burden of proof when it comes to stripping away a demographic's human rights is on you. Also, how does the study judge the policies without first reviewing the science available? I mean, you do go on to acknowledge the fact that it does in fact review the science available, but at the start you pretend like the fact that the title contains the words participation and policies somehow excludes it as a review of the science, which is completely dishonest. This really does seem to be a mad scramble to find anything you can to downplay what the study shows. And you're correct. The samples are limited and the study sparse. But it is better to use what evidence we do have properly than is to reject it and go on pure opinion. And I say properly since, once again, you drag up your mistake on muscle mass, which you really should have read properly, because you demonstrate a complete incompetence when it comes to the science being discussed, and a large part of that seems to come from sheer laziness. You seem to have swallowed Noel's arguments without a second thought, and had you asked anyone, they would have informed you of the facts that not only is Noel not an expert, he's a dishonest hack. That's why I outright refused to engage with him. I got tired of the way he kept editing my arguments to make himself look better. Much like yourself. But you are the one who chose to accept what he said without scrutiny. That fuck up has rendered this video as bad as your original when it comes to intellectual content, or worse when you consider the time and resources you've had. That is entirely on you. So that's the intellectual arguments dealt with. What I haven't gone over are the first 5 minutes of Woodford's video. That's because this is less about Woodford and more about the trans people he's hurting, and I thought the science being presented was more important to start with. But that's out of the way now, so why don't we turn back time to see what Woodford had to say for himself at the start. As always, please check out our other videos. You can also support Essence of Thought by Patreon, and in doing so, help us reach our goal of becoming ad-free. We'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone who's already given to the channel, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Brad R, McGay, Amit Devvodny, Muriel Zeebelstreif, John Schoenrock, Daniel Martinez, Robert McCallan, Sam Braxton, Ian Heimber, Alexander Williams, Atlas5, and Jennifer Hiller. And for myself and Adita, take care now.